Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Natalia Lerner, and I will be the facilitator of the webinar today. It is 1 o'clock here in Washington, D.C., and our webinar is about to begin. Our presenters today are Emma Dutton and Melanie Ross. Thank you for joining ANAB for our complimentary webinar on data quality, ensuring the validity of laboratory results using IEC 17025-2017. We're giving this webinar to provide further guidance on the data quality elements of the standard. Please note, we are recording this webinar, so it will be available for viewing in the future. You will also see with us Patty Williams and Ryan Fisher. Both Patty and Ryan are rotation managers here with ANAB, and they will be participating in our Q&A session at the end of the slide presentation. A little bit about our presenters. Dr. Dutton, an instructional designer for ANAB, has provided instruction on a variety of conformity assessment topics to the forensics community since 2013. Prior to joining ANAB, Emma spent more than 11 years as a quality assurance manager in a forensic laboratory. Her portfolio includes 12 years performing research and development in the pharmaceutical and biotechnology industries, as well as teaching biology as an adjunct professor at several universities. Our second presenter for the day, Melanie, has over 15 years of experience in quality assurance, quality control, and quality management. She has worked in a variety of industries, including chemical, biological, oil and gas, and aerospace, developing quality management systems, including internal audit programs, vendor qualification procedures, and implementation of Lean Six Sigma. Currently, Melanie is a technical product developer with ANAB, developing and delivering technical content on a variety of topics, including IEC 17025 and risk-based thinking. Before we get started, some logistics for the webinar. Due to the high attendance, everyone will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. Please enter your questions into Q&A box. We have planned time at the end of the webinar to answer questions asked. And again, please note, we are recording this webinar. Melanie, I'll pass it over to you now.
Thanks, Natalia. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Great. Thanks for the introduction. Emma and I will be tag teaming on this webinar, so I'll begin, then hand it over to her in a bit. During the webinar, we will review the requirements of ISO IEC 17025-2017, Clause 7.7, for ensuring validity of results. After going over the requirements, we will discuss ways laboratories can monitor the validity of results, as well as understand the importance of recording and analyzing data within the laboratory to detect trends. Finally, we will give a brief overview of ILAC's role in setting proficiency testing requirements for laboratories, as well as go over the ILAC requirements for proficiency testing. There are 3 subclauses within Clause 7.7. The first details the requirements for a procedure and quality control activities within the laboratory. The second subclause describes the requirements for participation in proficiency testing and/or interlaboratory comparisons. And the last one discusses the monitoring and use of the data generated from all of these activities. Next, we will go over the requirements within each of these subclauses in more detail. So I'll hand it over to Emma to start with subclause 7.7.1.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone. This is Emma. Subclause 7.71 states that there shall be a procedure for monitoring the validity of results and that the data from the monitoring activities shall be recorded. And you need to record this data in such a way to detect trends. And really, this is the whole point of this subclause and looking at those trends to ensure the validity of the results. The requirement goes on to indicate to use statistical techniques where practicable and to review the results or the data from the monitoring activity. The monitoring of the validity of the results must also be planned and reviewed. and shall include, where appropriate, the activities listed in A through K. So let's look at some of these monitoring activities. Some of these monitoring activities include the use of reference materials or quality control materials. This is a fairly common practice in most laboratories to use these reference materials and quality control materials as positive or negative controls. Another common practice is to do functional checks of equipment. This would be something like running those instrument diagnostic checks to make sure that they're working according to your specifications. In addition, we also do a replicate test or calibrations. We do retesting or recalibrations, and all of those are fairly common practices. This requirement from the old version, 2005, to the new version, 2017, changed just a little bit. There was one word that changed in the requirement that caused the majority of these to be required in the sense that you must do it. And that word was, it went from a may to a shall. Because of that, in this case, if you look at J, intra-laboratory comparisons, they're now required. And these intra-laboratory comparisons are what we have typically called in forensics those internal proficiency tests. But it's really the performance and the evaluation of measurements or tests on the same or similar items within the same laboratory according to predetermined conditions. If time permits, we can discuss a few more examples at the end of the presentation. So I'm now going to give it back over to Melanie and let her give us a little more information regarding subclause 7.7.2.
Thanks, Emma. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now let's look at the requirements for 7.7.2. Laboratories are required to participate in proficiency testing, or PT, or interlaboratory comparisons, or ILC, other than proficiency testing for the purpose of monitoring the laboratory's performance. Proficiency testing is the evaluation of participant performance against pre-established criteria and compares one laboratory's performance with the results of other laboratories. Proficiency testing programs should be operated in accordance with ISO IEC 17043 where available and appropriate. The 17043 standard contains the general requirements for proficiency testing. For some laboratory activities, formal proficiency testing programs are not available, or there are other reasons why the laboratory cannot participate in the formal proficiency testing program. In those cases, the laboratory must participate in interlaboratory comparisons other than proficiency testing. Examples of these interlaboratory comparisons other than PT include the evaluation of the performance characteristics of a method, comparison of results of 2 or more laboratories outside of a formal PT program, and support statements of the equivalence of measurements of National Metrology Institutes, or NMIs. While the standard requires participation in PT or ILC activities, the laboratory also benefits from regular participation in proficiency testing in many ways. Regular participation supplements the laboratory's internal quality control activities with an external assessment of its testing or measurement capabilities. When the laboratory is willing to have its testing or measurement performance evaluated through PT, there is added confidence to the interested parties because of this external assessment based on pre-established criteria. Laboratories can use interlaboratory comparisons and proficiency testing data to compare their performance to that of other participating laboratories, which again adds confidence to the results being produced by the laboratory. Additionally, ILCs and PTs can be a means of comparing analytical data obtained from different methods, because participating laboratories can use the methods employed in their own laboratories for the proficiency testing activities. And finally, ILC and PT activities can be used as demonstration of capability, confirming competent performance of a particular method, but also to confirm technical capabilities and competencies of laboratory personnel. Now we'll look at what ILAC's role is in proficiency testing. ILAC stands for the International Laboratory Accreditation Cooperation. It is the international organization for accreditation bodies, such as ANAB, operating in accordance with ISO IEC 17011, and who are involved in the accreditation of conformity assessment bodies. Conformity assessment bodies include calibration and testing laboratories, which we are discussing today, but also medical testing laboratories, inspection bodies, and proficiency testing providers. ILAC has policy documents that accreditation bodies and laboratories must adhere to in order to gain or maintain accreditation. One of those documents is the ILAC P9 policy document, which relates to participation in proficiency testing activities. P9 contains the requirements for proficiency testing participation above and beyond the 17025 standard. Accreditation bodies pass down these requirements to their accredited laboratories through their accreditation requirements. So let's look at ILAC P9 a little closer. First and foremost, laboratories must satisfactorily participate in proficiency testing activity prior to gaining accreditation. This satisfactory performance must be related to the proposed scope of accreditation. Forensic service providers must ensure successful completion of at least one proficiency test for each discipline prior to accreditation being granted. Additionally, the laboratory must plan further an ongoing activity appropriate to the scope of accreditation that is consistent with the PT participation plan and accreditation requirements relative to the specific program. We will go over the PT participation plan requirements after we look at the requirements of the accreditation body. Accreditation bodies must reference the importance of PT as a tool to demonstrate competence. ANAB does this through their accreditation requirements for calibration and testing laboratories and through the assessment process, where PT is reviewed at every assessment. The accreditation requirements also contain the minimum level and frequency of participation, as well as the need for a PT plan. For calibration and testing laboratories, the level and frequency is contained in AR 2251 and AR 2250 respectively. Requirements for forensic service providers are contained in AR 3125. These documents are available on the ANAB website. Frequency of participation for non-forensics laboratories must be based on the risk of the calibration or test associated with the scope of accreditation, all while covering their scope within a 4-year period. The risk analysis to determine frequency must be a part of the PT plan. Regardless of the risk analysis results, laboratories must participate in at least one approved PT or ILC activity or alternative each calendar year. If something is considered high risk, the laboratory would participate in that PT more frequently than others. And this is on top of the obligation again to cover the scope of accreditation within that 4-year period. For forensic service providers, performance of personnel must be monitored for each discipline for individuals conducting work per calendar year. Finally, the accreditation body must demonstrate how PT participation and performance will be reviewed and used during the assessment. As stated previously, proficiency testing is used to demonstrate competence of the laboratory and associated personnel. If there are issues with proficiency testing performance, that could impact the outcome of the assessment. Before we discuss the requirements for the PT participation plan, I want to state that laboratories should always consult the applicable accreditation requirements for specific requirements, such as a rolling 4-year period for non-forensics laboratories. The requirements listed here are directly from the ILAC P9 document. The plan must include the major field or discipline that is the subject of the PT activity, as well as details of the previous participation, such as month and year participation occurred. Obviously, planned or current participation must be in the plan, and finally the status. Was the PT activity completed, or is it in progress, or is it planned? The plan can contain other information than these minimum elements, and plans typically do contain more information. ANAB offers a PT plan template for non-forensics laboratories to use and is available on the ANAB website, but it is not required to use the template. Oftentimes, laboratories track participation via a laboratory information management system or simply an Excel spreadsheet. As long as the minimum requirements are included per ILAC and the accreditation requirements applicable to your program, that is acceptable. Now I'm going to pass it back to Emma for the last subclause. Are we having some technical issues?
Yeah, I believe Emma can, she's having some issues with her audio. Oh, I think, Emma, are you back?
Sorry about that. I was having some issues getting my audio to work. Back online now. So let's look at subclause 7.73. It states that the data generated from all the monitoring activities must be analyzed. And then you use this data to control and improve your laboratory activities. When you do the data analysis, if you find that the data analysis is outside the predefined criteria that you've already established, then you must take action to prevent incorrect results from being reported. And this is really the whole point of looking at the data and evaluating that data to ensure that the results go out the door correctly. So the underlying assumption here as well is that you have already predefined criteria in place and have established those specifications for which you're going to evaluate the data that you collect. Some examples of predefined criteria include, but are not limited to, using upper and lower control limits, having expected results for a positive or a negative control, using an established linear regression of, let's say, 0.98 for a calibration curve, or having a baseline or threshold value established, as well as defining what is the trend for the data that you're going to be analyzing. Oftentimes, these predefined criteria come from our validation data. The key takeaway for data analysis from these monitoring activities is that the information is used to control and improve the laboratory activities, as this will provide the verification and ensure that the laboratory results are accurate, reliable, and valid. So let's look at a few ways to analyze data from these monitoring activities. If we go back to subclause 7.7.1, it does tell us that we must record the data in such a way as to detect trends. We're usually very good about recording the data and using these monitoring activities, but in some instances, we may not record it in such a way to detect the trends. We also have to review the results of this data, and it does say use statistical techniques where practicable. So it gives you some flexibility. But you get to decide the best mechanism that works for you on how to record that data. It could be in spreadsheets, it could be in logs, worksheets. You can even use your laboratory information management system. So multiple ways for recording the data. It then goes on to say in 7.7.3 that we have to analyze this data that we've recorded. And the analysis of the data can be descriptive using statistical techniques, or you can employ various tools like graphs and plots and charts to actually visualize the data. So again, let's look at some examples of charts and plots, but you get to decide what works best for you in your laboratory. So keep in mind that just recording the data or the results from the monitoring activities in a spreadsheet or logbook is not sufficient. We must analyze this data. So we need to be able to detect the trends. We need to be able to analyze the data so we can control the data and make sure our results are accurate and valid. Following are two examples of data analysis. So this is an example of a control chart that has predefined upper and lower control limits. In this case, those limits are for the diameter of a York peppermint patty. Once you can analyze the trends using control charts or run charts such as this. In this case, we're monitoring the diameter of the York peppermint patty, and looking to see how close it comes to the upper control limit or the lower control limit. And we're doing it over a series of a sample of the whole product that is produced. The run chart of the control chart like this could also be used to evaluate calibration data using predefined upper and lower control limits to determine the calibration interval or to determine if the calibration interval needs to be shortened or lengthened. So in this case, you would take, instead of the York peppermint patty diameter, and put your calibration data. And then on the x-axis, you could look at the calibration that's performed over a period of months by taking an average of your calibration data. And you might be able to see that, yes, we're moving close to our upper and lower control limits when it's outside of our predefined established calibration criteria. But you might also see that if you have a 12-month cycle that is set and you run your calibration data over 15 months, where it does not go outside of those predefined criteria, you might be able to lengthen your calibration interval. But in some cases, you might find that it goes out of calibration status prior to that 12-month interval, so you may need to shorten your calibration cycle. Let's look at the next chart, and it's a frequency plot. It's just a different way to look at data using a frequency plot. The frequency plot is a graphic display showing frequency of occurrence over a particular time period. In this case, it's a frequency plot for the month of February, looking at various activities, just to give you the frequency of occurrence of those activities. For instance, we could say, if we're looking at the maroon bar, the red bar, 10 times in the month of February, the LIMS system happened to fail. So the LIMS application itself did not work effectively. Or you could look to see that 15 times during the month, also the network happened to go down. So you could plot any type of data from your monitoring activities in such a plot just to look at frequency of occurrence to see if it's within your level of acceptability for frequency of occurrence of that type of event. Many other ways to do charts and plots and graphs. You get to decide what works best for you and what is going to be giving you the best graphical display or the statistical analysis of the data that you have. Now I'm going to give it back to Melanie and let her proceed with wrapping up with some conclusions.
Thanks, Emma. So remember, monitoring activities are used to ensure the validity of results. Analyzing the data from these activities allows the laboratory to detect trends so that appropriate action can be taken to prevent incorrect results from being reported. Participation in PT and/or ILC furthers the confidence in the laboratory's competence by comparing the results with the results of other laboratories. All of these activities performed as required in Clause 7.7 ensure the validity of the results produced by the laboratory. Now I'll hand it back over to Natalia. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie and Emma. This was great, wonderful information. We've had quite a few questions come through, and we will get to those after we discuss some additional resources available for accredited laboratories or laboratories seeking accreditation. ANAB has many different media to further your understanding of standards, accreditation, management systems, and assessments. On the ANAB website, there are free webcasts on a variety of topics. These webcasts are about 5 to 20 minutes long, depending on the topic, and can be viewed at any time. ANAB also has a blog page with a wealth of information related to risk, accreditation, standards requirements, and others. We offer webinars such as this one at least monthly. Next, ANAB uses the heads up to send information to their accredited laboratories. These heads up provide updates on documentation, policies and procedures, as well as general information on the accredited laboratories. All of this historical heads up can be found on the ANAB website. Finally, ANAB offers training in the many areas, including internal auditing, standards, risks, and other topics. Those topics are not limited to laboratory accreditation. As with assessments, training can be changed significantly with the pandemic and travel restrictions. So, all of our traditional in-person courses have been converted to online versions and include exercises and discussions related to the topic at hand. We also offer web-based, self-paced training. All of these resources can be found on the ANAB website at anab.ansi.org. Now let's get to the fun part, your questions. Okay, are you guys ready?
I'm ready.
Ready.
Melanie, the first one is for you. Melanie, you mentioned the rolling 4-year period for non-forensic laboratory PT plans. What is the requirement for forensics? Actually, sorry, that would probably be more applicable to Emma.
Yes, I do think Emma should answer that question as our forensics expert.
Yep. So this was the question regarding more examples of monitoring activities to put on monthly frequency plots. I have seen, no, the first one regarding uncertainty of measurement?
No, it's about the timing of the PT. What is the requirement? So for non-forensics laboratories, it's a rolling 4-year period as far as going through their scope of accreditation. So if you could go over how that pertains to forensics laboratories.
Yeah. I'm probably not seeing all the questions that you're seeing because I don't see that one. So for forensics, the timing of proficiency tests, if you could repeat that because I don't have that question in my Q&A pod.
Sure. So when Melanie mentioned the rolling 4-year period for non-forensic laboratory PT plans, what is the requirement for forensics?
Okay, so for proficiency test, and this is the current definition of a proficiency test, which is an inter-laboratory comparison. And those are typically what we're calling those external proficiency tests, where you purchase a proficiency test from a proficiency test provider, and you have it assigned for the laboratory monitoring. So that requirement for the laboratory monitoring is one proficiency test per calendar year for the discipline that's listed on your scope document. And that's for the laboratory monitoring. For individual personnel monitoring, you still have to monitor individuals, and there are multiple ways to monitor individuals, and you can use proficiency tests or inter-laboratory comparisons or intra-laboratory comparisons, or even do a direct observation. And so that monitoring that is required for the individual is one form of monitoring per calendar year in the discipline in which the individual performs casework.
I think you've answered that. I just realized why you were not seeing that question. That question was typed to me in a chat box. So please, everyone, if you do have questions, please type them into Q&A. That allows our finalists to see them as well. Okay. Next question, and I will read it out loud. Sort of topic, but in relation to 7.7 and the corresponding uncertainty clause 7.6. Typically, chemical production testing labs that utilize published method, i.e. AFCM methods, use the R reproducibility and R repeatability to relate their within the uncertainty in industry. Any push to require labs to report their uncertainty, i.e. site precision, on their reports within their results, site precision is tighter than R, and sometimes. And that question was not finished, so I'm sorry, that question came from somebody named Patrick. Patrick, I do not see the rest of your questions, so if you don't mind finishing it up, and then I will ask it again. So at this point, I'm going to move on to the next question. Can you give more examples of monitoring activities to put on a monthly frequency plot? Emma, take that one, please.
Yeah. So there are different types of monitoring activities that you could use in a frequency plot. Some that come to mind for me, and this is from my experience in a forensic laboratory, if you're doing the reagent reliability checks, maybe you want to check the reliability of your reagents and you do this on a weekly basis or maybe a monthly basis, you can plot that in a frequency plot to see, you know, how frequent does that check fail. Different things that you can plot could be any of the checks that you use with your positive controls to look at trends, to see the frequency of how frequent it might not work if you want to do it that way. In most instances, their run charts, control charts, in my experience, have been one of the better charts to use to look at trends over a period of time, where the frequency plots come into play when I have used them when I'm evaluating the frequency of occurrence, typically of non-conforming work events that have occurred. Yeah.
Thank you. Melanie, next one is for you. What happens if the laboratory does not complete successfully the PT? Do they have to buy another one, or is it enough by doing the root cause analysis and the corrective action and reanalyze the original PT?
Oh, that's a good question, and I might have Ryan chime in here as well from an accreditation manager perspective on that one. You definitely need to do your cause analysis and corrective action when you have a failed PT. Reanalyzing the PT sample may not be the best depending on the risk to the organization. It may be the best option to go ahead and do another round of that PT to ensure that you do have the proficiency within the laboratory, but it does depend on the cause analysis and the risk to the organization. Ryan, do you have anything to add?
The risk side is a big issue as well, and with that being presented inside the 2017 revision, you know, it forces us to you know, take into account, you know, what impact is it also going to have on our customers, the frequencies that we do these types of calibrations or tests, whatever it may be, and it's part of the root cause analysis and in the investigation. It may be a situation where another test needs to be completed just to make sure that those outliers aren't presented again. If they are presented again, then we have a bigger issue where, you know, potentially the accredited parameter may have to come off the scope for a period of time until we can have that reassurance that those results are provided satisfactory, not only within the organization itself, but also, you know, within the industry.
Thank you. Next one is for Emma. Emma, what should you do if you cannot find a PT for a certain parameter?
So I was reading the question again. If you cannot find a proficiency test for a certain parameter, that's a very good question because there, in some cases, are not proficiency tests available for some of the forensic disciplines. We don't require each specific parameter to have an external proficiency test, so you have to keep in mind that the definitions that we've used in forensics for proficiency tests have changed. And so for us, the proficiency test now, by the definition of 17025, is that inter-laboratory comparison, or what we have typically called the external proficiency test. So to meet the requirements of the external proficiency test, you're absolutely right. Like for crime scenes, there may not be a crime scene proficiency test that is available from a proficiency test provider. But there are certain aspects of crime scene work that is done that you can find that proficiency test or that inter-laboratory comparison available. For instance, you could purchase from serology an external proficiency test that deals with the identification of bodily fluids. And you may do that at a crime scene, so that could cover your external proficiency test requirements for that discipline. If you cannot find an external proficiency test that is applicable for your discipline, and these are referring to those external proficiency tests that you have to submit the results back to ANAB, please contact Patty Williams, and she can direct you or assist you in locating or giving you some kind of approval to do an external proficiency test, a different type.
And Melanie, do you have anything to add on a non-forensic side to what Emma has provided?
No, I mean, she covered it pretty much, what we require on the non-forensic side as well.
Awesome. Next question. Melanie, this one is yours. In relation to 7.7 and the corresponding uncertainty clause 7.6, typically, chemical production testing labs that utilize published method, i.e. SCM methods, use the R reproducibility and R, small r, repeatability to relay within their uncertainty in industry. Any push to require labs to report the uncertainties, i.e. site precision, on their reports with their results. Site precision is tighter than capital R and sometimes small r. Go ahead.
Yeah, and again, I'll answer this one, and then if Ryan has anything to add, we can have him chime in too. The accreditation bodies don't require testing laboratories to put uncertainty on their test certificates. If the customer requires it or a regulation requires it, then uncertainty does need to be put on the certificate. With that said, though, the laboratory needs to have available, the testing laboratory needs to have available that uncertainty number, the calculation of uncertainty, in case it is requested by the customer. Now this is, when I say not required on the report, it's a testing report. Calibration certificates do require uncertainty. Do you have anything else to add, Ryan?
Yeah, this actually happens to be a hot topic this week. And, you know, it is the reverse side for calibration, that uncertainty, you know, the standard tells us we have to report it. Our accreditation requirements tell us that we have to report it. But in a simplified way where the customer agrees that uncertainty is not reported, that's captured through contract review. And everybody has to understand the risk that's involved of not reporting that out. Now, when it comes to statements of conformance, and those are being reported out to the CAB's customer, you know, uncertainty is needed to help form that decision. You know, there's other simplified ways to, you know, do a conformance test type situation where pass-fail does not consider uncertainty, but when you look at the whole aspect of metrology on the calibration side, we need to understand what all those components are to say whether a measurement passes or a measurement fails.
Thank you, Ryan. Next one is for Anna. Are OQC activities mandatory in 7.71? Can a laboratory choose a relevant QC activity?
Yes, let's go back to the requirement and read it as stated. The last sentence of the requirement in 771 says the monitoring shall be planned and reviewed and shall include, and then gives you a little flexibility because it says where appropriate, but not be limited to. And then it gives that list of things to consider. So you certainly have the ability to choose from that list of A through K items, those things that you want to implement to monitor the validity of your results. But keep in mind it says where appropriate, and there may be some things that are not appropriate to implement. I know for us in forensics, the last one, K, says testing of blind samples. That's very difficult for us to do in forensics, and oftentimes it is not appropriate for us to implement that type of monitoring activity. So you have some choice.
Wonderful, thank you. Melanie, next one is you. Is individual PT required by ISO 17025?
Well, that's a loaded question there. If you're talking about the individual people in the laboratory, that depends. It's not required by the standard, but it is required, as we spoke about, for forensics laboratories. The individual performing those methods need to be put through a proficiency test in order to ensure that they're competent. If you're talking about the individual tests or calibrations on the scope of accreditation, then that's based on the accreditation requirements and the ILAC policy document as far as covering the scope of accreditation within that cycle that is defined by the accreditation body. So you would really need to look at the accreditation requirements for the accreditation body that performs your accreditation in order to know what the requirements are specifically. As I did mention, for the non-forensics laboratories, ANAB requires that you do a risk assessment of the tests or measurements that you're performing in order to determine what the frequency of the PT should be.
Thank you. Emma, next one is yours. Do you have some examples or templates for technical reviews for forensic laboratories?
Yes, from my experience as a quality manager, I do have some templates for technical reviews for forensic laboratories. This is an interesting way that we implement monitoring of the validity of the results in forensics, and it is specific to forensics that we require technical review. I would suggest you reaching out to your colleagues in other laboratories and ask them for their examples. But from audits, from assessments, from being a quality manager, I've seen multiple spreadsheets and multiple ways to record technical review.
Thank you. Melanie, you're next. How can we detect trends if we only do one proficiency test per year? Would it take at least 3 or 4 years to begin to see a trend? We just started proficiency tests last year.
Okay, good question. So detecting trends is not just in your proficiency testing. Remember, we went over the entire 7.7 clause, and in 7.7.1, as Emma mentioned, you have a lot of different activities that you will be performing in your laboratory as what we traditionally call quality control activities, and those are where you're really going to be looking for the trends within your laboratory. What you want to look at for your proficiency tests that you're performing, obviously, if you successfully completed that proficiency test, and who is performing it in the lab. Is it the same person every year? Because the proficiency test is supposed to challenge the competency or demonstrate the competency of the laboratory itself. So you want to look at that from a risk perspective. But then again, the trends that you're looking at aren't just from proficiency testing. They're from all those other activities. Your quality control charts, if you're using run charts from your standards that you run every day, reviewing reported results, all of those activities that were in 771, you will define what your criteria is for those and what a trend would look like.
Thank you. Emma, next question goes to you. In a laboratory with 5 people, is it possible to carry out an internal check?
I'm not sure I understand the question in its entirety because I'm not sure what the internal check is regarding. So if there could be some little more clarification on what internal check are you referring to?
we'll ask for some of that additional information to come in. In the meantime, Melanie, I'm going to move next question to you. Is it acceptable to do an interlaboratory or ILC other than PT to monitor the system if we don't get a successful result on the PT?
Oh, that might be better answered by Ryan or Patty from an accreditation manager perspective.
Start with Ryan and then give it over to Patty so she can add whatever is needed for the forensic side.
Yeah, Natalia, if you wouldn't mind, can you repeat that question?
Is it acceptable to do an interlaboratory or ILC other than PT to monitor the system if we don't get a successful result on the PT?
Well, I think it's a double-edged sword in that situation. Ultimately, whether it's intra, or a PT, if something isn't right and we have something as an outlier, we still have to perform some sort of investigation as to why it happened. And with that, it'd be easier to try to figure it out if it was an intra-laboratory comparison. We're controlling the scheme, we're controlling the procedure, we're really taking a look at how the individuals are performing internally, so the investigation would probably be easier in that perspective. The difficult side of an inter-laboratory comparison and a proficiency test, you're not really sure about those situations that were presented to the other participants. You only know what you have done internally to control what you have provided as results for the report and being analyzed against the other participants. So a lot of assumptions happen when you start to look at other uncertainty values or other reported values for the inter-laboratory comparison or the proficiency test. So, it may be a situation where an outlier may not mean anything, depending on the investigation that takes place and what is the risk for us to accept this unsatisfactory result or this outlier. How is it going to impact the customer? So that risk mitigation is going to be critical. It could be a low risk thing. It could be a high risk thing. It just depends on what that impact is for the customer, really.
And I will speak from the forensic side. It is required for the forensic customers to evaluate their results and take action for any unexpected results. However, this action can be quite simple or quite complex, similar to how Ryan described the events. Now, one thing in forensic proficiency tests, generally the method or technology is not specified. So when a difference of reporting is discovered, it may be an indication that the laboratory is using different methodology, technology in this test than all the other participants. And it's the difference in reporting or the difference in the proficiency test results due to the limitations of that particular laboratory. So there can be many causes of differences in results seen in these proficiency tests. But we do require that actions take place, the laboratory investigate this difference, take the appropriate actions, and successfully complete whatever action plan they had in order to move forward. And that may include another testing round, whether it be another proficiency test round or some testing round internally.
Thank you both. Melanie, next question is for you. Can you give examples of laboratory comparisons. Would comparing results for one analysis by multiple analysis qualify? And I'm going to expand that question, but something that just came into a chat box. What will be the difference between interlaboratory comparison and retesting?
Yeah, sure, I can answer this, and then maybe Emma will want to chime in too for the forensic side of things. Examples of intra-laboratory comparisons, like you said, would be one analysis performed by multiple analysts. But what you want to consider here is when you're doing that intra-laboratory comparison, regardless of what the activity is, you want to have predefined criteria. What does it mean to have a successful intra-laboratory comparison? And when is it required to take action on the data that you've gotten? You could also do the intra-laboratory comparisons. Let me start over. You also want to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples. So if they're running an analysis with multiple analysts, then you want to run the same reference material or certified reference material through that as a test or the calibration. But you're correct that multiple analysts on one analysis would qualify. And then what was the follow-up to that question, Natalia? Could you repeat that?
What would be the difference between interlaboratory comparison and retesting?
So intra-laboratory comparison, from my perspective, is multiple analysts. So if you're retesting the same sample and it's the same analyst testing that sample, then you really aren't comparing anything. You're comparing the analyst to themselves. So you want to involve multiple analysts to do that. But it needs to be a planned activity. So like I said, you need to have the predefined criteria. And if you're taking a customer sample and retesting it or recalibrating it, then that is not necessarily intra-laboratory comparison because you're not comparing the differences in the laboratory, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Emma, do you have anything to add from the forensics perspective?
I think from forensics perspective, it's very similar to what Melanie indicated, that yes, an intra-laboratory comparison would be doing the same analysis by multiple analysts and only comparing within that laboratory. And Melanie is right on that. To do that, you have to have those predetermined conditions already defined and written down. You have to know what it is that you're going to expect the result to be. And that may be one of the difference between doing a retest. On a retest, we're retesting in forensics at least an item of evidence. And while we have the expected results from the primary analyst, it's not those predetermined conditions that are already outlined and predefined. So a slight difference for us.
We got a follow-up question on that. Is it acceptable to perform an intra-laboratory analysis on a PT sample?
I'd say from forensics, yes. And I've seen that done from my experience. We have in the past purchased inter-laboratory comparisons or proficiency tests and then use them later in another year for the intra-laboratory comparisons. All the while, keep in mind that there are specific requirements if you do that because the results cannot be known to the test taker. But we have used old proficiency test samples for intra-laboratory comparisons to compare within the lab.
And Melanie, for non-forensic side?
Yes, it's exactly the same. Using the proficiency test samples can give you that predetermined criteria already because you have it from the proficiency test program. So I've seen that in a lot of laboratories where they will use their proficiency test items to do their intra-laboratory comparisons.
Awesome, thank you. Emma, this is your question. Could you bring examples of 7.7.1d, use of check or working standards with control charts where applicable?
Yes, for forensics examples, I have used check standards or working standards to do an intermediate check on the calibration status of a scale or balance and have then plotted that data. If it's performed on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, you can then plot that data over time and put it on a control chart to see how that scalar balance is performing over a period of time using that check standard. So you use your, in this case, your calibrated mass reference standards, do that monthly check, plot the data over a period of months, and see how it's trending over time with upper and lower control limits already predefined. So we would set tolerances of plus or minus 0.01 or 0.001 and then make sure it was trending within that tolerance.
Melanie, do you have anything to add from non-forensic side for this one?
No, that's exactly the same on our side.
Perfect, thank you.
So I'm not sure we had any clarification come in regarding is it possible to carry out an internal check with 5 people in the laboratory?
Yeah, I have a couple examples for that right now, and I don't see it. I'm going to keep going, but in the meantime, Melanie, I have one for you. Can you give more examples of monitoring activities to put on a monthly frequency plot?
Additional monitoring activities, it can be any of those activities in clause 7.7.1. As Emma mentioned, running check standards, running reference materials through the test or measurements that you're performing, and putting those on the frequency plot. It could also be, as Emma was saying, doing the frequency of your balance checks as well. So any of the activities within 7.7.1 could be used to put on a frequency plot. So another example is when you're reviewing reported results, you could say how many times did a certain issue arise? How many times did you have to correct a report or send out an amended report? Emma, do you have any other examples?
No, that was exactly the example that I was going to go to, and looking at this list of monitoring activities that's a perfect example. If you're reviewing reported results, and then in a frequency plot, if you have, how many times did this happen, or did we see this from that review of the reported results? Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. And we're getting close to the end, so I have two more questions. One very quick one. Ryan, that question is for you. How do people can sign up to receive heads up?
Yeah, currently what we have within our system, we have a main contact for the cab, and that distribution list is put together internally in the office, and when we have a heads up, it gets pushed out to that main contact. That's the easiest way that we can do it at this point here. If you're not the main contact within the cab, you might want to get with that individual and ask them to forward you any heads ups that come along. At this time, our system doesn't allow us to push out multiple emails to an organization, and that's just a restraint that we have at this time.
Thank you. And one last question that just came in a chat box privately, so I'm going to read it because the panelists cannot see it. How many techniques must a laboratory apply to assure the results? The laboratory can assure that with 1 or 2, or could it be accepted, that would be accepted for during an external audit? Okay, I'm not clear on that question. So what I think you're asking is, how many techniques can a laboratory utilize to assure the results, and how many techniques would be accepted during the external audit? That's how I read that question, Melanie. I'm going to give that one to you. Let me know if you read it differently.
Okay, and this might be good for Ryan and Patty to chime in too. If you're saying how many techniques, how many of the 771 items need to be applied in the laboratory to assure results, that's really laboratory dependent and based on the risk to the laboratory. So looking at what methods are you performing, what's required of the method, and what is the risk to the end result? Because remember, these activities are ensuring the validity of the results that are going out to your customers. So you want to incorporate as many of those activities that make sense in your organization and that will ensure the validity of those results before you're reporting them.
I can answer for forensics. In forensics, we expect the proficiency test to use your approved methodology and to be worked as if it was casework coming into the laboratory. So to use the same process. And the beauty of the proficiency test, it may be able to identify a weakness or improvement opportunity in your process alone. So that is what we require. There is not a required number of technologies to employ, but in the forensic world, it is not typically standard to use every technology that you have for the proficiency test, because many times there are time restraints on working the cases as well.
Patty, Brian, do you have anything to add?
For me, it's time and resource, right? The accreditation requirements, having those minimum participation things are set by the accreditation requirements for calibration testing, medical testing, whatever it may be. Now we need to get into what 771 says, and if we identify any of those areas that we can help mitigate risk, then it's our responsibility to figure that out. The standard says here's a list, but not limited to, right? I mean, it went from 5 possibilities to 12 now, and it's just giving us more options and different ways we can start to analyze our data. So what Melanie and Emma said is really carried out throughout just about all of our programs, just the principles of it. Now we just need to understand what is the risk, and do we need to go dig into those a little bit deeper and further to understand assuring the quality of our results. Patty?
Thank you, Ryan, Patty, Emma, and Melanie. Thank you very much for this presentation. Thank you for answering questions. Thank you, everybody who has joined. If you would like any additional information about training offered by ANAB, you can contact us at training@anab.org. If you have questions about accreditation or the services ANAB provides related to accreditation, please contact us at anab@anab.org. And finally, if you're ready for Quote of Accreditation Services, you may contact Roger Muse at rmuse@anab.org. If you do not remember any of those emails, feel free to go to our website and just click Contact ANAB, and we will internally ensure you will get to the right person. Thank you again for joining us, and a recording of this webinar will be available on our website. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.